On January the 12th, 1888, the temperature in Dakota Territory fell 55 degrees in 7 hours. The storm that arrived that afternoon killed more than 200 people across 3 territories, most of them children who had walked to school that morning without heavy coats because the air felt like spring and their parents saw no reason to worry. Elias Nordstrom, a man who had homesteaded Dakota for more than a decade and buried a wife and a son to cold, that was nothing compared to what January would deliver, had said plainly in the August before that storm, when the real cold comes, she'll crawl back begging if those Larson children haven't starved first. He was 63 years old. He had lost 2 fingers on his left hand to a winter milder than the one that was coming, and he believed what he said the way a man believes arithmetic, not cruelly, but with the earned certainty of someone who has watched certainty fail everyone around him. He was wrong. He was 8 feet below the frozen surface of Astrid Bergman's claim the thermometer never dropped below 47 degrees. 5 people who should have died slept through the worst night in Dakota's recorded history. But that is the end. The beginning is a girl of 17 standing alone on 160 acres of prairie in high summer watching ants build, still learning what the earth beneath her feet had always been trying to say. The typhoid came in spring, the way bad things come on the prairie, without announcement, without mercy, without the courtesy of arriving one at a time. Astrid Bergman's mother went first. 11 days of fever that moved through the cabin like something alive, followed by a Tuesday burial on a hillside that faced east, where the morning light came first and stayed longest. Her father lasted 2 more weeks, long enough to see that the meadowlark outside the window kept singing through all of it, indifferent to grief in the way that only wild things can be indifferent. He lasted long enough to make her promise. His lips had gone dry, and his eyes looked past her at something beyond the cabin wall, something she could not follow him toward, and his voice arrived in fragments. The land is everything. Don't let them take it. The land is everything. She buried in him beside her mother on that same eastward hillside. She was 17 years old, and she was the last Bergman on 160 acres of Dakota soil, alone except for a mare too old to pull a plow and a claim shanty whose walls were single-layer cottonwood boards over tar paper, built well enough to prove she was working the land and not well enough to survive what the land could deliver. The claim was real, at least. Her father had arrived in Dakota 6 years prior, when the territory was still being partitioned into squares by men with transits and government maps, and he had filed under the Homestead Act, paid his fees, worked the soil without stopping for 4 years, and earned the right to the 160 acres the territory acknowledges his. When he died, those acres passed to the daughter who had worked beside him through every one of those years. The law was clear on that point, even if the community at Elm Creek was less so. Astrid knew the law because her father had explained it to her the same autumn he made her memorize every fence line, every marker post, every boundary between their land and a neighbor's. You don't protect what you don't know the edges of, he had told her. She knew the edges. What she did not know was how to hold everything inside them without him. She found the ledger while cleaning the cabin 3 days after his burial, tucked beneath the floor plank. He lifted to store documents safe from moisture. A small notebook, the cover worn smooth at the corners, filled with his handwriting in columns, tracking what came in and what went out over 6 years of homesteading. Most pages were strictly practical: seed costs, harvest figures, freight prices from Ordway. But the last page broke the pattern. Partway down in the careful script he used when something mattered.Ograph, 6 weeks clearing, stumps after my leg break, took no payment. Said neighbors don't keep accounts. Below it in smaller letters with ink that had faded as though written weeks later, the land is warm if you go deep enough. She did not know what that second line meant. She folded the ledger, put it in her apron pocket, and did not think about it again until she needed to. The Larson children arrived at the Elm Creek schoolhouse in the last week of August, carried to the Sunday gathering by a neighboring family who had agreed to transport them, but not to keep them. Their father, Eric Larson, had been killed 2 months earlier along the James River when a cottonwood he was felling twisted in its fall and came down wrong, crushing him before anyone nearby could reach him. Their mother had died in childbirth 3 months after that, the infant dying with her inside of a day. What remained was Sarah, 9 years old, with her mother's eyes, and her father's absolute refusal to let anyone see her frightened. Jonas, 7, whose hands had been balled into fists since the neighbors came to deliver the news and who had not fully unclenched them since. And Nora, 4 years old, who still asked with the relentless persistence of a child who has not yet learned that repetition doesn't change facts. When is Mama coming back? When is Mama coming back? The meeting ran the way these things ran in small communities where resources were scarce and goodwill had practical limits. The adults of Elm Creek assembled between the wooden benches and debated the fate of 3 children, the way people debate an inconvenient problem when they are trying to be decent but have already calculated what decency will cost them. The orphan train from Bismarck was not scheduled until October. The territorial facility in Yankton was mentioned then, quickly unmentioned by 2 women who could not quite bring themselves to say it plainly. A family near the river offered to take 1 child, not 3. Another said they barely had enough for their own. The silence that followed stretched long enough to become the particular kind of uncomfortable that small communities produce when everyone present is waiting for someone else to solve a problem they all recognize as real. Astrid had not come intending to speak. She had sat through the early proceedings without offering anything, watching Sarah across the room, holding Jonas and Nora against her sides on the corner bench, the older girl's face composed into a stillness that cost her something to maintain the kind a child learns when she has discovered that showing fear makes adults uncomfortable and therefore less useful. Jonas stared at the floor. His small hands were fists. Nora had closed her eyes against her sister's shoulder. The room talked around all 3 of them as though they were furniture that needed to be moved to a more convenient location. The silence came again, longer this time. Astrid stood up. Her voice, when it came, was steadier than she felt. "I'll take them." Every face in the room turned toward her, a girl of 17. Unmarried, not yet fully her father's height, her hands still rough from summer fieldwork, her parents 3 months in the ground on a hillside half a mile from where she was standing. The weight of that collective attention arrived all at once from every direction, and it was physical the way judgment always is. Elias Nordstrom occupied the front bench with the authority of a man who had survived everything the prairie had offered him and believed that survival gave him standing to speak on any subject related to it. His left hand rested on his knee, the gap where 2 fingers had been clearly visible. He was not a cruel man. This was important to understand about him because what came next was not cruelty. It was the arithmetic of survival delivered without softening, which can feel identical to cruelty if you are the one receiving it. "You can't keep yourself alive, girl." His voice carried to every corner of the room. "How do you expect to keep 4 alive?" "I'll manage." "Managing isn't surviving." He leaned forward slightly, deliberate rather than aggressive, the way a man leans when he needs the words to land somewhere specific. "You need 30 cords of firewood to get through to April. That's 1 cord every 4 days for 7 months. Can you swing an axe?" She told him she had chopped kindling. She told him this knowing already what it would produce. Kindling. Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile. A cord is a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long, dense hardwood, every piece split and stacked. Your father, with a healthy team and a strong back, needed 3 days to produce a cord. You have what that swayback mare. He addressed the room briefly, and the room murmured its agreement in the way rooms do when they have heard an argument solid enough to require no addition. 30 cords. Say you manage a quarter cord a day, working from dawn until the light fails. That is 120 days of cutting. Winter comes in 60. Astrid did not answer because there was nothing to answer. The numbers were correct. She had been doing the same arithmetic for 3 consecutive nights, lying awake in the cabin and arriving at the same conclusion every time. 30 cords was impossible. Coal cost $1 per 100 pounds at Ordway, and she needed $20 worth minimum, and she had $4.60 in the tin behind the stove. Nordstrom was not wrong about a single figure. His arithmetic and her arithmetic agreed completely. He stepped closer. The settlers behind him watched. His voice shifted, not softer exactly, but less public, the register a man uses when he wants to be heard as sincere rather than merely authoritative. Find a husband or send those children on the orphan train while there's still time. Don't kill them with your pride. She looked past him at Sarah in the corner. Sarah had not moved. The girl's eyes were open now, watching Astrid with the focused attention of a child who has spent months cataloging which adults in her vicinity can be trusted with the weight of a real decision. Jonas had looked up from the floor. His hands were still fists. Nora slept. Then I'll find another way. Nordstrom shook his head with the patience of a man who already knows the ending. There is no other way. There is firewood and there is coal. Those are the only two ways to survive a Dakota winter, and you cannot do either. She walked out of the schoolhouse without waiting for the room to formulate a response. Behind her through the open door, his voice carried into the August afternoon, 60 days until first freeze. Mark my words, she'll be back before the first snow. She kept walking. The grass on both sides of the road was tall and yellow-tipped after a dry summer, and the sky above Elm Creek was the particular deep blue that comes to Dakota in late August, high clear and infinite in a way that feels like either freedom or exposure depending on what you are carrying. Astrid was carrying $4.60, 3 children, who shared no blood with her 160 acres that would become a coffin by January if she followed either plan anyone had offered. And a question she had not yet spoken aloud, not to Nordstrom, not to Ruth Hensley, not to anyone, because it had been living in the back of her mind for 3 weeks, growing the way a certainty grows when you have accumulated enough evidence to suspect something true, but not yet enough to say it without sounding like the unstable girl the settlement had already decided she was. 3 weeks earlier, she had been walking the western fence line of the claim when she passed the harvester ant mound she had observed every summer since her family arrived in Dakota. She had been watching it since she was 14, not with any systematic intention, but with the attentiveness that develops in people who grow up on the prairie and learn early that the things worth watching are often very small. The mound had always been large, perhaps 18 inches at its peak, surrounded by a cleared disk of bare earth, where the ants had stripped every blade of grass within 3 feet. She had spent hours as a child lying on her stomach, watching the workers carry fragments of soil grain by grain, building their city, according to principles she could observe but not decode. This summer, the mound was different. The height had grown to nearly 2 feet taller than she had ever seen it. The bare disc had expanded from 3 feet across to nearly 5. And the soil the workers were carrying to the surface was different, in a way she noticed without immediately understanding, darker, denser, tinged blue-gray, in the way that only deep clay looks material from a depth her father's plow had never reached. She knelt beside the mound and watched for close to an hour. The ants moved with urgency that had no equivalent in any previous summer. She had observed them purposeful, in a way that looked less like ordinary industry and more like preparation for something the season had not yet declared. Her father's voice arrived the way it always did now, without warning in the exact cadence of the original. If the ant hills are high in July, the coming winter will be hard. The creatures know they prepare while we're still sweating. She had asked him once how they knew. He had shrugged in the manner of a man who accepts mystery without needing to solve it. Same way the geese know when to fly south. Same way your mother's joints ache before a storm, the world speaks to those who listen. The ants were building higher than any summer she could remember. They were carrying earth from depths she had never seen them reach. They were preparing for something the calendar had not yet revealed, with an intensity that was, for anyone paying close enough attention, indistinguishable from warning. She stood, continued walking the fence line, and said nothing about it to anyone because there was nothing to say yet. It was an observation. It became a question only later in the silence of the tea, in the hours when the absence of her parents was loudest. The root cellar behind the cabin had never frozen. Every autumn, her father had dug it out, a pit 4 to 5 feet deep, lined with straw, packed with potatoes and turnips and the hard winter squash that could survive until March if you kept it cold but not crystallized. In February, when the drifts piled above the roof line and the wind found every gap in the tar paper and the walls groaned under pressure that felt personal, even then the root cellar held. Cold enough to preserve, warm enough to prevent rot, the earth holding a temperature that the cabin above it could never match, holding it passively without fire, without any human effort beyond the initial digging. 3 miles south, the Simonson family lived in a dugout carved into a hillside, not a cabin, but a horizontal excavation into the earth with a sod roof and a door frame set into the slope. Astrid had been inside once, 2 winters prior, delivering eggs for her mother. The memory that stayed was the warmth, the specific surprise of a physical reality contradicting expectation. The body receiving information the mind had not been prepared for. The Simonsons had a small fire. The interior was 4 feet deep, at most partially surrounded by earth on 3 sides, and it was warmer than any room in the Bergman cabin had been all that winter. She had noticed it. She had filed it without a category. The noticing waited patient, accumulating until enough of it arrived to become something more than noticing. The thought came fully formed in the early hours of a July morning, the window still open to the prairie, dark sounds of the summer night arriving through the screen. What if she went deeper? Not 4 feet, not the depth of a root cellar or a hillside dugout. What if the earth's warmth increased with depth? What if there was a point 6 feet, 8, 10 feet down where the ground never froze at all, where the temperature held steady through February? Regardless of what happened at the surface, the ants were going deeper than any summer she had watched them. The root cellar held its temperature through winters that destroyed everything above it. The Simonson place, crude and partial, outperformed a well-built cabin on the coldest nights. The math of what she couldn't afford pointed toward a dead end. The math of what she had observed pointed toward a question no one had yet asked. She walked 4 miles to the schoolhouse 3 days after the ant mound observation, arriving in the late afternoon when the last students were filing out into the summer heat. Miss Ellen Dawson was 28 years old from Minnesota, with reasons for coming west that she had never discussed and that the settlement had stopped asking about. She taught 23 children for $40 a month, plus whatever vegetables the families could spare, and she slept in the small room behind the classroom, and she was among the adults Astrid had access to, the only one who kept books. The shelf behind the teacher's desk held perhaps 30 volumes, and one that Astrid had registered without knowing why she was registering it, a thick volume with illustrations on the spine, published out of Philadelphia, titled Homes of the Cliff Dwellers. Miss Dawson let her borrow it without asking for a reason, which was one of the things Astrid valued about her. She carried it home and read it by the cabin window until the light failed, and then by lantern until the oil ran low. The book described structures built into canyon walls in a place called Mesa Verde in the southwestern territories. American ground, arid and ancient, nothing like Dakota, but sharing the same sky. The cliff dwellings were extraordinary, but it was a single chapter near the middle that stopped her, a description of circular pits dug into the earth with their roofs at surface level, entered by ladder through a hole in the center. The people who built them called them kivas. The text described them as cool in summer and warm in winter, maintained at habitable temperature by the surrounding earth, requiring only a small fire to function through the coldest months. She studied the cross-section drawings until the lantern guttered. 8 feet. That was the depth in the illustrations she kept returning to. The floor of the chamber sitting well below whatever frost the surface delivered. The ancient builders had discovered what the ants already knew, what the root cellar demonstrated, at a fraction of the scale, that the earth is not an inert material, indifferent to temperature, but a massive thermal body that stores heat the way stone stores heat. After the fire beneath it dies slowly, deeply releasing warmth against the cold above through the simple inertia of mass. She did not have the science for it. She had the evidence. 4 feet kept potatoes alive through February. The Simonson dugout was warmer than a well-built cabin, and the kivas of people who had survived centuries of hard winters were 8 feet deep and described as comfortable. She needed to know whether this principle would work in Dakota's specific soil-dense clay, mineral-heavy, fundamentally different from desert rock, and whether she could build it alone. For the first question, she needed someone who understood Earth. For the second, she needed tools she did not own. Ruth Hensley had been running her claim alone for 3 years, since her husband died in a threshing accident caught in the machinery during harvest, in a way that was over before the men beside him understood what they were watching. She was 38, sharpened by solitary hard work, into someone who dealt in useful things and did not traffic in reassurance. She had helped Astrid twice since the typhoid, once with a small flour loan, once with county recorder information. Ruth was reliable in a crisis precisely because she did not pretend a crisis was anything other than what it was. Astrid walked to her claim the morning after finishing the book. She asked to borrow a pickaxe and a good shovel. Ruth set down the harness she was mending and looked at her with the directness she applied to everything. "What for?" Astrid told her. "All of it, the ant mound in July, and the darker soil the workers were carrying from unusual depths. Her father saying about high hills in summer. The root cellar that had never frozen in 6 Dakota winters, the Simonson dugout, and the warmth she had felt there 2 winters prior. The book from Miss Dawson, the drawings of the kivas, the measurements in the text, the question that had been building in her for 3 weeks about what lived at 8 feet down in Dakota clay in January." Ruth listened without interrupting her habit, and one of the things that made people trust her assessment, even when the assessment was unfavorable. She poured 2 cups of weak coffee and set one in front of Astrid and looked at the far wall for a moment before she spoke. "I've seen dugouts. My parents lived in one when they first settled before they moved north. They flood when the rain comes hard. Snakes nest in the walls. The sod roof sags and collapses if you don't rebuild it every few years. And that's at 4 feet." She shook her head without hesitation, but without hostility either. "Going deeper just gives you a deeper grave. You'll hit water before 8 feet, and then you'll drown instead of freeze. The Simonson place doesn't flood. The Simonsons are on high ground with good drainage. Where does your claim sit? Near the creek, but there's a rise on the south side, good slope away from the water table. I've looked at it carefully." Ruth set her cup down. The lines around her eyes deepened in the way they did when she was thinking rather than simply reacting. "And if you spend 4 weeks digging and the whole thing fills with mud, you've lost a month you could have spent cutting whatever wood you can and praying for a mild winter." Astrid met her eyes across the table and said the thing she had been building toward since she walked in. "A mild winter will kill us. The cabin's not enough even for an average year, not with me alone and 3 children to heat for. I can't cut 30 cords. I can't buy coal. If I do what everyone expects, we die in January. That is not a possibility I'm willing to accept." Ruth was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, prairie grass moved in a slow wind, carrying the first faint suggestion of autumn beneath the summer heat, bending all in one direction, recovering, bending again. Something about that rhythm occupied her while she thought. "You're gambling everything on a hole in the ground. I'm gambling everything because I have nothing left to lose." Ruth stood up. She walked to the shed behind her house and came back carrying a pickaxe, its head darkened with surface rust, its edge still sound, and a long-handled shovel whose blade had been replaced at some point, judging by the mismatched wood at the joint. She held them out without ceremony. There was nothing tender about it. It was a transfer of equipment, practical and direct, except that practical gestures sometimes carry the weight of things a person has decided not to say out loud, things about her own parents. In a winter they survived underground when the neighbors above them did not. And what a child makes of that knowledge over 40 years. "If you're going to dig your own grave," Ruth told her, "at least make it a proper one." The settlement turned against her before she drove the first shovel into the earth. Words circulated through the particular channels that small, isolated communities use Sunday gatherings, and chance encounters on the road to Ordway, and children repeating fragments of adult conversations they were not meant to absorb. By the time Astrid started digging in the first days of September, the common account had already solidified. The Bergman girl was watching ants and had decided to bury herself in the ground, which proved she had been damaged by grief, which meant someone responsible ought to intervene before the Larson children suffered for her instability. Miriam Calder was 47 years old, wife of Henrik Calder, who owned Ordway's general store, and she possessed a memory that held grievances the way good soil holds water completely without draining, ready to nourish whatever grew from them. She had been watching the Bergman situation with the focused interest of someone who thinks in terms of land and leverage. The claim was 160 acres of proven soil with reliable water access, and her son Thomas was 19 and had been expressing interest in the Bergman girl since midsummer, which made the property potentially available through marriage if Astrid was willing, or through tax seizure if she failed and the claim was abandoned, or through guardianship challenge if the children could be removed and the legal occupancy disrupted. Miriam was patient. She established the narrative at first: the girl is unwell, driven to strange behavior by grief, observing insects and planning to hide underground, not a fit guardian for children who deserve stability. She spread this account at the quilting circle across the store counter through the specific conversations she had with the wives of men whose opinions shaped the settlement's collective conclusions. Then she wrote to the Territorial Orphan Board in Bismarck, expressing concern about 3 young children in the care of an unwell young woman who had refused every reasonable form of community assistance. The board replied that they would investigate in the spring when travel permitted. Miss Dawson brought Astrid the news on a Wednesday, walking 4 miles from the schoolhouse with the letter's contents memorized, having heard it from Ruth Hensley, who had overheard Miriam describing the response at the store counter with a satisfaction she did not trouble to conceal. Astrid received the information standing at the edge of the pit she had begun 3 days earlier, still only 2 feet deep, the loose topsoil yielding easily, but the first hard clay already showing at the bottom edge. She stood with a shovel in her hands and felt the information settle into her chest like cold water. "She's trying to take them," Astrid said. "If the board finds me unfit, they won't act until spring." Miss Dawson held her gaze steadily. "They don't travel in winter. You have time. Time for what to do, exactly what Miriam wants. Marry Thomas Calder and hand over my claim. That would solve the problem." Astrid looked at the woman who had come west from Minnesota for reasons she would not discuss, who lived alone behind a schoolhouse and taught 23 children for $40 a month and whatever the families could spare. "My father died for that claim," she said. "My mother is buried on it. I will not surrender it to the Calders because Miriam thinks she can frighten me into compliance." "Then keep digging," Miss Dawson said, "and hope you're right about the ants." The first stones came on the 11th day of digging. Astrid was chest-deep in the pit past the topsoil and into the heavy clay that had slowed her progress to fractions of what the early days had promised, when a rock struck the earthen wall 6 inches from her face and sent a fine spray of clay against her cheek. She looked up into the white noon glare and saw 5 children at the rim silhouetted against the sky. The oldest was perhaps 11. She recognized him eventually as the eldest Nordstrom boy, broad-shouldered like his father, with his father's certainty borrowed and deployed without his father's earned authority. The second stone was aimed better. It caught her left shoulder hard enough to raise a bruise that would still be yellow at the edges 2 weeks later. From behind the group, she heard Sarah's voice strained high. "Stop it! Stop it! Leave her alone!" And Jonah, smaller and more furious, "Get away from her." Their voices were thin against the laughter. Astrid climbed out of the pit without hurrying. The children scattered immediately, their laughter fading over the eastern rise. The Nordstrom boy paused long enough to deliver his inherited verdict. "My father says you'll be dead by February, living in your hole like a badger." Then he was gone. She found Sarah behind the woodpile, sitting with her knees pulled to her chest and her arms locked around them. her face turned away. Jonah stood beside her, fist still clenched, his expression, the specific, helpless fury of a 7-year-old who understands precisely what the situation requires and is precisely too small to provide it. Nora was in the cabin, too young to decode the event, but old enough to be frightened by its noise. Sarah did not ask if they were going to D. She asked something harder. "Are you sure?" Astrid knelt in front of her. The bruise on her shoulder throbbed in time with her pulse. She thought about what honesty required, not the softened version, not the reassurance that would be a kind of lie, but truth at the exact angle a 9-year-old who had already lost everything once could actually use. "I'm sure about the ants. I'm sure about what the earth holds at depth. I'm not sure about myself." A pause. "But I know how to find out." Sarah considered her with the evaluating eyes of a child who has spent months deciding which adults are worth her trust. Then she stood, walked back to the pit, and looked down into it. "Then we keep digging," she said. The clay defeated her on schedule. She had known it was coming, had felt the shovel begin to drag in the final hours of the second day as the topsoil gave way to what lay beneath. But knowing something approaches and receiving it when it arrives are different operations. The clay at 4 feet was dense yellow-brown, compressed by centuries of prairie rain, and the accumulated weight of everything above it, and its resistance felt almost deliberate. The pickaxe bounced. The shovel blade bent under a full-force stroke. Every load she lifted now required the pickaxe first to break the material loose, then the shovel to gather it, then the bucket to haul it to the surface on the rope she had rigged over a wooden frame made from scavenged lumber. Sarah and Jonas worked the rope in turns, serious about it, with the seriousness children adopt when they understand the task is real. Nora passed water down in a canteen on a second rope, watching from the rim. Her blisters broke on the 3rd day in the clay. She wrapped her hands in strips torn from a petticoat and kept working, changing the cloth every 2 hours when it soaked through, using the crook of her elbow to hook the shovel handle when her grip could no longer manage it. Progress slowed below a cubic yard per day. The pit walls rose around her like a fact she had agreed to live inside. The rain came on the 11th night, hard and sustained, the kind of September rain the dry summer months make you forget is possible. Astrid ran out in the dark and found 8 inches of muddy water pooling at the bottom of the pit, the clay walls slick and beginning to slump, 10 days of careful excavations submerged in brown soup. Ruth's voice arrived without invitation, going deeper. "Just gives you a deeper grave." She spent the full next day bailing bucket after bucket of mud, hauled up the rope, and dumped downslope hour after hour until her legs refused their function, and she had to sit at the edge of the pit to keep from falling in. By nightfall, the pit was drained, but she had lost a full day, and the rain had shown her something she could not afford to ignore. The pit needed drainage, a channel cut from the lowest point of the floor, angling downhill toward the creek, giving any future accumulations somewhere to go instead of somewhere to collect. She spent 2 more days on the trench, 40 feet of shallow channel, cut through sod and roots and clay. 14 days gone. The pit sat at barely 6 feet. She needed 8. Frost was less than 5 weeks away. On the morning of the 15th day, she was at the bottom of the pit, her shoulders carrying their particular constant ache, which she had stopped registering as pain and begun registering simply as information about progress, when she heard a wagon crossing the open ground of her claim. Not the dry creak of an unloaded farm cart, but the heavier, slower roll of weight being transported. She climbed to the rim and shielded her eyes against the September glare. 2 horses pulled the wagon, healthy animals, calm and well-fed, nothing like the aging mare in her small barn who could no longer pull a plow. The wagon bed was loaded with timber, cottonwood posts, thick-cut, the bark still green with sap. The man driving was 67 years old, with joints that moved cautiously and a face so weathered it had passed beyond the category of lined and arrived at something closer to geological. He climbed down with the deliberateness of someone who had learned not to hurry movements that could go wrong. Otto Graf had lived on a quarter section 4 miles north of the Bergman claim for longer than most of the current Elm Creek settlement had been in Dakota, and he had grown so unsociable in the years since his second wife's death that the community had largely stopped including him in its mental map of the people who lived there. He walked to the edge of the pit and looked down into it without particular expression. He looked at Astrid standing chest-deep in the earth, her hands wrapped in bloody cloth, her dress caked to the knee with clay, and said what he had apparently come to say. "Your father helped me clear stumps the year I broke my leg. 6 weeks of work, and he never asked for payment. Said neighbors don't keep accounts." She did not answer immediately. She was thinking of the ledger entries she had read 3 months ago and filed away without understanding it. "I don't need charity," she told him. "Didn't say it was charity." He nodded toward the wagon. "Said your father did me 6 weeks of work. I figure I owe his daughter 4 days. These logs are 2 of them. Tomorrow I'll bring more." He unhitched the horses and began unloading without waiting for further discussion. 12 posts each, 6 inches thick and 12 feet long. 20 cross beams, straight-grained and seasoned enough to work with. Enough timber to build the roof she had not yet figured out how to build. Astrid climbed out of the pit. Her legs shook badly enough that she had to press one hand against the earthen wall. She asked the question she actually needed answered. "Why now? 3 weeks ago, everyone in this settlement was telling me I'd be dead by February." He set the last post down and straightened slowly, pressing one hand against his lower back, and looked at her with the unhurried honesty of a man who has stopped caring about other people's opinions and therefore has no reason to be anything other than accurate. "3 weeks ago, you hadn't proved you meant it. Now you have." He climbed back onto the empty wagon, turned the horses north, and drove back across the open prairie without looking behind him. The timber sat in a pile beside the pit. The sun was dropping toward the western horizon. Astrid stood, looking at the raw posts and cross beams and the proof they represented. Not that she was right, not yet, not about any of the things that actually mattered, but that she had dug long enough and hard enough and without quitting to be taken seriously by at least one person who had no reason to offer her anything he did not believe she had earned. She picked up the shovel. The clay at the bottom of the pit was waiting. She had 6 feet. She needed 8. Frost was coming in the way frost always came to Dakota, without negotiation, without delay, and with a patience that outlasted every argument made against it. She went back down. Otto returned the next morning with willow poles, thin and flexible, cut in lengths that told her he had already calculated the span she would need without asking. He unloaded them without ceremony, stacked them perpendicular to the posts he had brought the day before, and drove back north before she could formulate a question she did not already know the answer to. On the 3rd day, he arrived with a coiled rope, a paper bag of iron nails, and a flat piece of shale he had hauled from a creek bed somewhere south of his claim, nearly 2 feet square, one face naturally smooth, its edges rough where it had been levered free of surrounding stone. He set it beside the pit and gestured at the shaft without elaboration for the windbreak. Otherwise, the draft kills your flame every time the surface wind shifts. Then he left, and she did not see him again at close range that season, and when she encountered him at the Orway store 3 weeks later, he walked past her as though the exchange had never occurred, which she understood was not rudeness, but the specific social grammar of a man who considered the account settled and had no interest in ceremony. The knowledge he had provided in that one sentence about the shale deflector sent her back to the Cliff Dweller book with a different set of questions than she had brought to it the first time. She had read it before for confirmation, for evidence that underground chambers could hold warmth. She read it now for engineering, for the specific relationship between the entry shaft and the fire pit, and the ventilation that made the whole system breathe instead of suffocate. The text was not a manual. It had been written by a man from the East who was interested in the strangeness of what he was describing rather than its functionality, and she had to extract the principles from language designed to produce wonder rather than instruction. But the principles were there. Cold air entered low, warmed by the fire, and the accumulated heat of bodies, and earth rose by convection and exited through the central entry hole in a continuous circulation that required no mechanical assistance, only geometry, only the correct relationship between intake and exhaust, only the shale deflector positioned to break the direct draft so the fire could breathe without being extinguished by the air that fed it. She studied the drawings until her eyes ached, then walked to the Simonson homestead 3 miles south and asked Mrs. Simonson questions the woman found peculiar, but answered anyway about how their fire behaved in high winds, whether smoke ever backed into the room, how the floor temperature compared to the air at shoulder height. The answers confirmed what the book suggested. She paced the perimeter of the Simonson dugout, measuring with her stride, and with a knotted rope she had carried for the purpose, comparing the proportions to the drawings she had memorized. Then she walked home and did the arithmetic in the dirt with a stick until the numbers made sense and the geometry resolved into something she could build. The roof design she settled on followed the same principle as the kivas, but simplified to what her available materials and solitary labor could actually achieve. 4 center posts set in holes bored 2 feet deep at the corners of a 12-foot square, their tops extending to 6 feet above the pit floor, the minimum height that would allow her to stand upright in the center without bending. Cross beams running between the posts and radiating outward to the pit walls distributed to carry the load evenly. The willow poles Otto had cut laid across the beams, close enough together that nothing larger than a closed fist could pass between them. Prairie grass hauled by the arm, load from the surrounding acres piled thick across the willows, functioning as insulation against both cold penetration from above and thermal loss from below. Then sod blocks cut 3 inches thick in double layers, roots facing upward, finished with a cap of compacted earth, tamped firm and smooth. The entry hole presented the most consequential design problems she had encountered. A square opening 3 feet across, framed with a scrap lumber to prevent the edges from crumbling inward or under the pressure of the roof above it. That part was straightforward. The difficulty was the interface between the hole and whatever weather the surface delivered, because any gap that allowed a person to pass also allowed water, snow, and wind to pass, and these 3 things were specifically what she was trying to exclude. She built a collar 6 inches high around the opening from packed earth and clay, forming a rim that would direct surface runoff away from the edges. She lined the interior framing with tar paper salvaged from the cabin wall and tested the whole assembly by pouring 3 full buckets across the roof in the rain that came the week before completion. The water ran to the collar, diverted, disappeared into the grass. Nothing came through. The ventilation shaft required 2 days on its own. A vertical bore 3 feet from the main chamber wall sunk to floor depth, then angling 90 degrees to enter the chamber through a horizontal tunnel just wide enough for her arm. At the interior opening, she positioned Otto's shale slab on edge set so that incoming air was forced to travel around its sides rather than straight into the room, the deflection that would keep a small fire alive in a 40-mile-per-hour surface wind. She tested it with a candle flame held at various positions inside the chamber, watching the movement of the smoke, adjusting the shale's angle by increments until the circulation felt right. The flame bent gently toward the entry hole without guttering. The air moved. The system breathed. By the morning of October 9th, 35 days after the first shovel cut the prairie sod, in the opening days of September, the shelter was complete. She stood at the surface and looked at what she had made, a low mound of packed earth and prairie grass rising perhaps 18 inches above grade, unremarkable enough that a rider passing at distance might mistake it for a natural feature of the terrain. A square timber frame at the center marked the entry. 3 feet away, the small raised mark of the ventilation shaft's exit. That was all that was visible. Everything that mattered was below. She descended first, carrying Nora, whose grip on her neck was tight enough to press her collar against her throat. The child smelled the earth before her eyes adjusted to the dimness, that dense mineral smell of deep clay, cold in a way that was different from cold air, the cold of mass and permanence rather than wind and exposure. The ladder rungs had been cut from a straight-grain section of the timber. Otto had left 12 steps down from rim to floor. Halfway down, Nora's grip loosened. The child turned her head and looked at the curving walls and the sleeping benches Astrid had carved into the earth along the perimeter, and the fire pit in the center lined with stones carried from the creek in her apron, and the shale deflector standing at its precise angle beside the ventilation opening. The surface temperature that morning was 34 degrees. Inside the chamber, the thermometer Miss Dawson had lent her read 52. 18 degrees warmer, without a single log burned, without any heat source beyond the earth itself, which had been absorbing summer warmth through its upper layers for months, and was releasing it now into the enclosed space the way a heated stone releases warmth after the fire beside it dies. "It's warm down here," Nora said, her voice carrying the particular quality of a child encountering something that contradicts what they had been frightened of. "Astrid, it's warm." Sarah came down next. She walked the full perimeter without speaking, pressing her palm against the clay wall in two places, looking up at the willow pole ceiling, through which thin strips of gray October sky were visible in the gaps, not enough for cold to penetrate. She seemed to understand only enough to tell you the world above still existed. Jonas descended last and stood in the center, with his head almost reaching the ceiling's lowest crossbeam, breathing in the earth smell, and declared that it smelled like a cellar. "It is a cellar," Astrid told him, "a cellar large enough to live in." She lit the first fire that evening with 2 split logs and a handful of dry grass for kindling. The smoke rose in a clean column toward the entry of a hole drawn upward, exactly as the book had predicted, the convection current establishing itself within minutes as the warmer air inside sought the cooler opening above. Within an hour, the thermometer had climbed to 62 degrees. The children removed their coats. Nora was asleep on the sleeping bench before anyone thought to suggest it curled without a blanket into the carved earth shelf with the ease of a creature returning to a place it recognized without having been there before. Astrid fed the fire carefully, watching it adding nothing beyond the original 2 logs. She wanted to know how the earth performed without assistance. By midnight, the fire had been cold for 3 hours, and the temperature inside had dropped to 57 degrees, still 20 degrees above what the abandoned cabin would have held on an identical night. The earth was retaining what the fire had added to what it already carried. She recorded both figures in the small notebook she had begun keeping for this purpose, pencil stub worn to 2 inches columns. She ruled with a straight edge of scrap wood, date, surface temperature, pit temperature, wind direction, precipitation, wood burned. The record was thin in October. By January, it would be the most important document she owned. The 19th brought the first genuine freeze, not the early autumn chill that arrived in the mornings and retreated by midday, but a hard freeze that left the water bucket sealed overnight and blackened the last of the garden squash she had meant to bring inside the week before. Surface temperature dropped to 11 degrees above zero. Without a fire, the pit held 50 degrees, 39 degrees warmer than the open air. She lit a small blaze for cooking that evening, let it burn 2 hours, and the temperature climbed to 64. The children ate supper in their shirt sleeves, Jonas complaining mildly about the heat, which was the first ordinary complaint she had heard from him since August, and which felt like something had been returned. When she climbed the ladder to check the surface afterward, the cold met her at the opening like a wall being pushed through, rather than walked into solid, immediate indifference to her presence. 11 degrees above zero felt like a different civilization from the chamber below. November delivered what October had only threatened. The first blizzard arrived on the third 3 days of sustained wind and heavy snow that built 18 inches on level ground and considerably more against every vertical surface on the property. Surface temperature dropped to 22 below zero on the worst night. Wind speed she could not measure, but could feel through the sealed entry cover as a continuous pressure variation, a rhythmic flex that told her the gusts were coming in waves from the northwest. She checked the thermometer 3 times on the second night, 22 below, then 26 below, then back to 22 as the wind shifted slightly. In the pit, 49 degrees throughout, 71 degrees warmer than the surface air. She had burned less than a quarter cord for the entire month of November. In the cabin, the floor she had slept on for 6 previous Dakota winters would have required a minimum of 3 cords for the same period, and the interior temperature on the coldest nights would still have dropped below freezing despite the fire. The notebooks grew dense. She tracked everything. Wind direction turned out to correlate with surface temperature in patterns she began to anticipate. Northwest wind reliably preceded the worst cold by 4 to 6 hours. Pit temperature showed a lag of roughly 2 days behind sustained changes in surface temperature, which told her the Earth was averaging over time rather than responding immediately, which was exactly what she needed it to do. The differential between surface and pit increased. As winter deepened in October, it had ranged from 15 to 20 degrees. By late November, it was running 40 to 50 degrees on cold nights. By mid-December, on nights when the surface temperature dropped to 20 below the pit, held 50 degrees without any fire at all, a 70-degree gap that felt when she looked at the paired figures in her notebook, less like a temperature difference and more like the distance between two separate realities. But something was also changing in the walls. She had begun pressing her palm against the clay at different heights during her morning inspection, learning the feel of each layer, the upper wall that was already hard and cold, as ceramic tile, the transition zone where the clay shifted from frozen to merely cool, the lower wall near the floor where the earth retained its dense living warmth. The frost line was descending. She had known it would. Frost always descended in Dakota winters, traveling downward through the soil as the season progressed, reaching its maximum depth sometime in February before the spring thaw began reversing the direction. What she did not know, what no one she had asked could tell her, because no one had measured it at this specific location in this specific soil type at this specific depth, was how far it would go. Elias Nordstrom appeared at the end of November, on a morning when the temperature had temporarily risen to 5 above, and the sky had the white brightness of a cold day without wind. He sat his horse at the edge of the mound and looked at the wisp of smoke rising from the ventilation shaft's surface exit. Astrid climbed up to meet him. She had not seen him since the schoolhouse meeting in August, and his face had changed in ways she was still cataloging when he spoke. Still alive. Not quite a question. Still alive. November isn't January. He shifted in the saddle. His missing fingers or their absence seemed to pull at the reins. The ground hasn't fully frozen yet. Another 6 weeks and the frost will reach your floor. Then that hole becomes an ice box. A pause that carried the weight of 11 survived winters. The frost line in Dakota is 6 feet. I'm at 8. Who told you that would be enough? She met his eyes across the distance between horseback and standing ground. The earth did. I've been measuring. Even when it's 20 below the floor, stays above 45. She did not add that she was still uncertain that the frost was still moving, that the notebook figures only extended through November and February remained ahead of her like an unanswered question in a language she was still learning to read. She said none of that, Mom, because Nordstrom would not have found it reassuring, and she did not need to reassure him. She needed to hold her ground. He studied her for a long moment, his horse patient beneath him. Something moved behind his eyes that was not quite doubt and not quite concession, but occupied the space between the two. Wait until January, he said. Wait until the real cold comes and the ground freezes deeper than you planned. Then we'll see if the ants were right. He rode on without waiting for a response, and she watched his horse carry him north until the prairie swallowed both of them. The frost line was at 5 feet by Christmas. She measured it by pressing her palm against the wall at graduated heights during her morning inspection, each day feeling the cold boundary half an inch lower than the day before the frozen earth, announcing its progress with the patience of something that has never lost a contest with anything biological. At the floor, the warmth held. She lay on her back in the pit one afternoon, with her eyes closed, and pressed both palms flat against the clay floor, and felt the earth giving back what summer had put into it, slow and steady, the thermal inertia of something that does not hurry, because it has never needed to. It was not comfortable warmth. It was not the warmth of a fire or a heated room. It was the warmth of mass, of depth, of geological patience, and it was enough. By New Year's Day, the frost had reached 5.5 feet. She made the calculation she had been avoiding for 2 weeks and let it sit where she could see it clearly. 2.5 feet remained between the frost line and the floor. The rate of descent had averaged roughly a half foot every 2 weeks through December. 7 weeks of serious cold remained before February's peak. At that rate, the frost would reach 7.5 feet, half a foot above the floor, half a foot of margin against the coldest winter the ants had told her was coming. If the ants had told her true, the winter would not be average. And if the winter was not average, the frost line would go deeper than her estimate. That was what she lay awake calculating on January 10th, while the children slept around her and the fire burned to coals and the thermometer settled toward 47 degrees. She did not tell the children. There was no version of the information that would have been useful to them, and she had made a private agreement with herself in September that she would carry the real uncertainty alone because she was the one who had made the decision, and the uncertainty was part of the cost of that decision. Thomas Calder came the last week of December. He came alone without announcement on a gray afternoon when the temperature had risen briefly to zero, almost pleasant. Astrid thought, which told her how thoroughly Dakota had recalibrated her sense of pleasant. She heard his horse before she saw him and climbed the ladder to find a young man she recognized from the Ordway store, 19 years old, built like his father, but with his mother's precision about where he placed his attention. He stood at the edge of the mound and looked at the entry hole and at the smoke from the ventilation shaft and at the thermometer nailed to the exterior timber frame, reading the exterior temperature, with an expression she could not immediately categorize. She did not invite him down. He asked if he could see it, and something in the way he asked, not demanding, not performing, genuinely asking, made her step aside and gesture toward the ladder. He descended carefully. She followed. At the bottom, he stood in the center of the chamber with his hands at his sides and looked at the thermometer on the interior wall, which read 51 degrees on a night when 0 was the ambient temperature outside. He looked at the notebook hanging from a nail beside the thermometer columns of paired figures running from October through late December, the story of the differential told in pencil across 30 pages. My mother wrote to the board in Bismarck, he said. His voice was even without apology in it, but without defensiveness either, just a person delivering a fact he thought someone else needed to have. I didn't know about the letter when she sent it. I know about the letter. He looked at the paired temperature columns for another moment. She told everyone you were unwell, that the ant story proved you weren't capable of caring for children. He paused and something shifted in his face, not sudden, more like something he had been working toward for longer than this conversation. She was wrong. Astrid waited because she could tell he was not finished. When the storm comes, and and everyone with any sense knows it's coming this year, the cold has been building since October in a way that doesn't feel usual when it comes. I'm going to tell people what I saw here, what this held, how warm it stayed, and with how little. He met her eyes across the fire pit in the enclosed warmth of a chamber that should not have been possible to build and should not have held the temperature it was holding. My mother will not like that. Your mother won't be wrong to not like it. My mother, Thomas Calder said carefully, is not here. He climbed out before she could formulate a response to that and rode back toward Ordway without looking back, and she stood in the chamber for a time after the sound of his horse faded, watching the thermometer hold steady, thinking about the specific courage it takes to disagree openly with a person who holds your livelihood in their opinion of you. January arrived, and the temperature dropped in earnest, settling into the range that separated Dakota winters from the winters of places that use that word more loosely. Surface readings in the single digits above 0 were now the good days. -10 was a cold snap. -20 arrived on the 9th and held through the night, and she climbed the ladder in the darkness to read the exterior thermometer and came back down to find the interior at 49 degrees, 70 degrees of separation between the world she had built and the world above it maintained by Earth, that asked nothing in return, that consumed no fuel, that required only that she had dug far enough. She was checking the frost line on the morning of the 10th palm flat against the clay at graduated heights, reading temperature through touch, the way she had learned to over 4 months of daily contact. When she noticed something the numbers had not yet reflected, the rate of descent was slowing. December had averaged a half foot every 2 weeks. The first week of January had moved the frost line perhaps a quarter inch. This was either good news or it was a false reading produced by the brief warming trend that had softened the single digits to 12 above for 3 days. She wrote it down without conclusion. The notebook did not allow for conclusions drawn from single data points. January 11th arrived warm. This was the fact that reorganized everything. She climbed the ladder at sunrise because she had climbed it at sunrise every morning since October, and the air against her face was different before she was fully through the opening soft in a way that Dakota air in January has no business being, carrying a temperature well above freezing, 40 degrees by the feel of it, possibly warmer. The wind was dead. The sky was that particular winter blue that comes after snow and before more of it, but the quality of the light was wrong for the cold that should have been present. Wrong in the way that any sudden, complete reversal of expected conditions is wrong when you have learned to pay close attention to expected conditions. The children came up behind her. Jonas immediately began forming snowballs from the drifts around the entry mound, packing them between his palms with the focused joy of a 7-year-old who had spent 2 months underground. Sarah tilted her face toward the light. Nora asked if this was spring. Astrid looked at the ant mound, visible now as a dark prominence against the snowfield 100 yards north where the prevailing wind had scoured the drifts thinner. She had not checked it since the first hard freeze in November. She walked to it. The mound was sealed. Every entrance bore the same closure she had seen on cold October mornings before the colony had finished its autumn consolidation, packed earth over each tunnel opening. Nothing disturbed, nothing suggesting interior activity. In March, when the first genuine warming arrived, she had watched the ants emerge within hours of the temperature crossing 40 degrees. She was watching the colony's own thermometer, the behavioral indicator of an organism that had been reading Dakota winters since before anyone had arrived to name the territory, and it was telling her that what she was standing in was not spring. Sarah appeared beside her. "Can we go to school?" The settlement had been mostly homebound since November. A warm day in January would bring families out from across the claim's children who had not seen each other in weeks, the particular energy of a community that had been isolated, releasing itself into unexpected good weather. "Everyone will be there today. Miss Dawson sent word last week that the warm spell would bring families in." Astrid did not look away from the sealed mound. The ants had not emerged. In every previous spring, she had observed when the temperature crossed 40 degrees, the colony responded within the day workers, appearing at the entrances, beginning the surface activity that winter had suspended. The temperature this morning was above 40. The colony was not responding. "Not today, Wayne," Astrid said. Sarah's face moved through the specific landscape of a 9-year-old's frustration, the compression around the eyes, the set of the jaw, the particular quality of restraint that meant she was containing something larger than what she was about to say. "You always do this. You always make us different. The other children already think we're strange because we live underground. Now we won't even go to school when everyone else does." Astrid knelt in front of her in the wet snow, the warmth soaking immediately through her skirt. "Look at the ant mound." Sarah looked. "What about it?" "When true spring comes, the ants come up. Every year, every time the temperature rises enough, they open the tunnels and come out within a day. I've watched them do it for 3 years." She took Sarah's hands. "They haven't come up. It's warm enough. They should be here. They're not. Maybe they didn't notice. Ants notice. They've been noticing for longer than anyone in this territory has been alive." She held the girl's gaze with the full weight of what she needed to communicate, which was not certainty. She was not certain. She had no more certainty than she had ever had about any of this, but with the specific quality of attention that the preceding 5 months had taught her. I don't know why they're staying down. I only know that they are. And I've learned this year to listen when they show me something I don't fully understand yet. Sarah pulled her hands back. Her eyes were bright with something complicated, not just frustration, but the specific hurt of a child who has had enough taken from her to understand what loss costs. You care more about ants than you do about us. She turned and climbed back down the ladder before Astrid could answer, and Jonas followed because he always followed Sarah, and Nora stood for a moment at the edge of the entry hole, looking between Astrid and the darkness below, before going down after the others. Astrid remained on the surface. The air was genuinely warm against her face, not the mild warmth of a brief thaw, but something sustained and complete, as though winter had made a decision and carried it through. Every sensory indicator she possessed said spring. The smell of the air said spring. The softness of the light said spring. The temperature said spring. Everything said spring except one colony of harvester ants in a frozen field who had been reading Dakota Winters since before the territory had that name, and who were still underground with their doors shut tight. She stayed on the surface and watched the horizon. By noon, she had counted 11 wagons making their way toward the schoolhouse families from claims across the settlement, bringing children into what felt like the first genuinely safe day in months. She watched them from the top of the mound until the last wagon disappeared over the eastern rise. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, she looked northwest. The darkness was there. Not cloud darkness, not the gray-white of an approaching snowstorm, or the purplish, heavy ceiling of a thunderstorm, but a different quality entirely, a black that occupied the sky from the northern horizon to the southern horizon, in a continuous wall advancing from the northwest with a speed that made no sense against the dead calm of the day because there was no wind to carry it, and yet it was moving faster than any mounted rider could have ridden in front of it. She watched it for exactly as long as it took her brain to process what her eyes were delivering. Then she ran. Down the slope of the mound, covering the distance to the entry hole in 11 strides, screaming before she reached it. Down, everyone, down now. She could hear Jonas from below. What's happening? And she was already at the ladder, already gripping the upper rungs when the wind arrived. It was not wind the way she had understood wind. Wind moves air from one place to another. What arrived on the afternoon of January 12th moved like a physical substance that had been compressed to a pressure beyond what air ordinarily carries, a wall of force, traveling at speeds she would later hear estimated at 60 miles per hour, carrying ice crystals so fine they were indistinguishable from air until they met bare skin, at which point they felt like glass dust moving at velocity. The temperature dropped 18 degrees in the 40 seconds it took her to clear the ladder and reach for the cover. 26 degrees and falling when the cover came down and the darkness below swallowed her completely. She could not see her hand in front of her face. She found the matches on the shelf by memory alone, 4 steps from the ladder base, arm's length to the right. The wooden box, smooth on 3 sides and rough on the 4th, where she had glued a strip of striken surface. The match caught on the second try. The small flame illuminated 3 faces, Sarah's, its careful composure finally broken open into something raw. Jonas's, his permanent fists clenched now against a threat he could not measure. Nora's pressed against Sarah's side with her eyes open and her breathing audible. Above the sealed entry, the sound was not wind. In the conventional sense, it was a continuous pressure, a roar that built and did not diminish, a sound that made the seal cover vibrate in its frame and seemed to absorb all the ordinary frequencies of the world and replace them with itself. "Light the fire," Sora whispered. "Please." The fire caught on the first attempt, which felt like the specific mercy that arrives occasionally when the other circumstances are terrible enough to require one. 2 split logs, the kindling already laid in the pit from that morning, the flame growing from a match-thin thread to something that threw shadows across the curved walls and made the sleeping benches in the stone-lined pit and the angled shale deflector visible again. Astrid held the match to the exterior thermometer's pulley cord, The second thermometer she had purchased in October mounted to the exterior frame with a hand-painted face visible from the inside through a slot she had cut in the wooden cover's edge. The reading came back 22 below. She had not been fully wrong about the cold front. She had only been surprised by the warm air that preceded it, the pressure differential that pulled the temperature above freezing for 8 hours before dropping it faster than anyone in the territory had experienced in any recorded season. The warm morning had been the exhale before the blow. Then the pounding came. 3 distinct strikes against the wooden cover hard enough that she felt the impact through the ladder rung she was gripping. Sarah screamed. Jonas pressed himself against the wall. The pounding came again, not debris, not wind-driven branches, but the unmistakable rhythm of a human fist, striking wood with deliberate force, and then a voice barely audible through the cover and the roar above it, "For God's sake, open." She climbed. She pushed against the cover, and the wind took it immediately from one hand, and she nearly lost it entirely. Catching it with her wrist rather than her palm, and holding against the pressure while ice crystals drove into her eyes, and the cold hit her face like a flat surface moving at speed. White in every direction, not the white of snow on the ground, but the white of snow in the air so dense it eliminated the difference between ground and sky, between near and far, between up and down. A hand grabbed her wrist. She pulled. A body came down the ladder in controlled sections, boots finding each rung, then the hand releasing hers to grip the top rung, then descent by degrees, and at the bottom, it folded onto the floor of the pit in the way something folds when it has reached the absolute end of what it has available. The coat was white with ice so thoroughly worked into the wool that the garment had become more ice than cloth. The hair above it was white. The eyebrows were white. Only the eyes still moved, and they moved toward the fire with a focused desperation that told her everything about the preceding hour. She recognized Thomas Calder by the set of his jaw and the particular angle of his collarbone visible where the coat had frozen open at the neck. 19 years old Miriam Calder's son, who had been in her shelter 2 weeks ago, asking honest questions. He was dying by the standard measure of the phrase, core temperature dropping in wet clothes, at temperatures that would be measured that night at -51, which was colder than anything recorded in the territory's brief official history. "Get the buffalo robe," Astrid said. "Sarah, move." Sarah already had it. "Heat water warm, not hot warm as your hand, Jonas, now." Her knife came out before she had consciously decided to use it, because the buttons on the coat were frozen solid and his hands were not yet capable of the motor coordination required to manage them anyway. She cut the coat away. Beneath it, the shirt and undershirt were soaked with sweat that had frozen against his skin, which was the specific mechanism that killed people in storms like this one. Not exposure alone, but the combined failure of wet insulation and extreme cold, working together in the 2-minute window. That was all bare skin required at these temperatures. She worked without speaking, and he tried once, his teeth making sounds like small stones striking each other in a jar. Horse went down half-mile. Couldn't see Sawyer Mound. She told him to stop talking. His fingers were waxy white, not the white of cold, but the distinctive pallor of frostbite, beginning its negotiation with circulation. A negotiation that had perhaps 40 minutes to resolve in circulation's favor before it resolved the other way. She wrapped him in the robe and put him as close to the fire as safe proximity allowed. When Jonas brought the water warm in the way Astrid had specified, she made Thomas drink in the careful increments of someone whose swallowing reflex has been compromised by cold, small amounts, slowly the warmth working inward from the core, rather than applied to the extremities, where the damage was visible, but where treatment would only drive cold blood toward the heart. After 10 minutes, the shaking that had occupied his whole body began to isolate itself to his hands. After 20, he could hold the cup. After 30, the color began returning to his fingers, pink first, then the deeper flush of inflammation, then the particular expression of someone learning that their hands hurt, which was the best possible news because it meant they were recovering rather than going permanently elsewhere. "The thermometer," he said eventually. His voice was rough, as though the cold had scraped something from it. "On your wall." What does it say? She told him 51 degrees climbing. He looked at the paired figure she had read to him and the figure he had felt on his skin 40 minutes earlier. Whatever happened in Thomas Calder's understanding in that moment happened quietly without theater. He was 19 years old and he had nearly died walking half a mile from his own house in a storm that had arrived without sufficient warning on the warmest January morning in recent memory, and he was sitting at 51 degrees in a chamber dug by a 17-year-old girl whom his mother had described in a letter to the territorial authorities as mentally unfit to care for children. My mother said you were crazy. He said it without any particular emphasis, the way you state a fact you are in the process of revising. Said watching ants and digging holes proved you weren't fit to care for children. I didn't argue with her. I should have. Astrid said nothing because the statement did not require a response that she had available. Thomas looked at his hands, pink now, painful in the way recovery is painful but whole. When this storm breaks, I'm going to tell everyone what I found here. What temperature this held, how much wood you burned. A pause. My mother is not going to like that. She won't. No. He settled the buffalo robe around his shoulders and looked at the fire with the expression of a man making a decision he had been approaching for longer than he realized. But I am here, and she is not. The storm ran for 19 hours. She climbed the ladder every hour to read the exterior thermometer through its slot -11 at 5-26, at 7-44 at midnight. At 3 in the morning, the coldest hour of the coldest night in Dakota's recorded history, the exterior thermometer read -51 degrees. She held that number in her head for a moment, standing on the ladder with the cover sealed against her palm, feeling the cold radiate through the wood like something with intent, and then she climbed back down to where 4 people were sleeping at 48 degrees in the warmth the earth had been holding since summer, and she added the figure to her notebook without commentary because the notebook had never needed commentary. The number said everything that needed saying. The storm broke at 9 in the morning. She knew it before she reached the cover, because the sound changed the sustained roar that had occupied 19 hours, dropping in increments over roughly 40 minutes until it was first wind and then breeze, and then nothing, a silence so complete after what had preceded it that the absence of noise felt like a new kind of pressure. She pushed the cover aside and climbed into a world that had been remade overnight, into something she did not immediately recognize as the same ground she had walked across the day before. The cold was -44 degrees. The thermometer confirmed it before her body fully processed it, though her body was making its own rapid assessment. The specific burn of extreme cold against exposed skin is different from ordinary cold, more immediate, less negotiable, carrying a message about time that regular cold does not bother to deliver. Exposed flesh at -44 has a brief window before the message becomes permanent. She had perhaps 7 minutes of useful function before she would need to return below. She began digging through the drift that had buried the entry mound while the storm built and sealed everything under 3 feet of wind-driven snow. The landscape bore no resemblance to itself. Every familiar feature had been converted into unfamiliar topography. The woodpile was a smooth white curve. The fence posts were buried to their wire. The cabin she had abandoned in October was visible only as an angular interruption in the otherwise organic forms the drifts had built around it. The wind had scoured the high ground and deposited everything in the lee of any vertical surface, building drifts that in places exceeded 10 feet against the north face of structures and dropped to bare frozen ground on the southern exposures. The sky was blue in a way that had no warmth in it. Blue the way something is blue when all other qualities have been removed. She was scanning the property line out of habit, cataloging the damage when she saw the shapes. Half a mile south in the direction of the schoolhouse, dark forms interrupted the white field. Not the angular darkness of a structure or the vertical darkness of a post. Horizontal forms low to the ground. The particular configuration that a human body makes when it has stopped being a person in motion and become a fact about weather. She counted 4 visible shapes from the entry mound before she stopped counting and started moving. The cold at ground level without shelter was a different proposition from the cold inside the pit, and her body registered the transition in the way a body registers the difference between reading about something and standing inside it. Each breath arrived as a controlled burn in her chest, not painful yet, but precise, carrying a clarity about duration that forced her to set pace against distance in a calculation that did not leave room for hesitation. She moved across the scoured ground at the fastest rate her legs would sustain without requiring recovery, her eyes fixed on the forms ahead, her mind running simultaneously on two tracks, the one measuring distance and time and temperature, and the one that was not running calculations at all, but simply moving because there was nothing else to do. Miss Ellen Dawson was the first form she reached. The school teacher lay on her side in a position that looked chosen rather than fallen into her body curved around a smaller shape, her arms locked in an embrace that the cold had preserved exactly as she had arranged it, some final deliberate act of warmth offered to the child she was holding, even as her own warmth left. Her face was turned slightly upward and carried the quality of stillness that extreme cold produces in death, not the violence of other deaths, but something closer to the absence of expression. The face returned to its simplest state. She was 28 years old. She had come west from Minnesota for reasons she had never discussed and had taught 23 children in a single room for $40 a month and whatever the families could spare. And she had died in the open ground, half a mile from the schoolhouse. She had locked the remaining students inside with instructions to feed the fire until help arrived. The child she was holding was not alive. The child beyond that was not alive. Astrid registered both facts in the peripheral way she was registering everything except the center of the huddle, because she had seen from 30 feet away what she needed to reach a slight movement, almost nothing, the kind of motion that could be wind effect on frozen clothing. Except the wind had died and this movement was irregular, biological, the specific randomness of something still operating on its own. 4 children had formed a circle in the storm, pressing together in the instinctive response to cold that does not save the group, but sometimes saves the one in the middle. And the one in the middle had been the smallest of them, sheltered by bodies that could no longer shelter themselves. Henry Olson was 8 years old, Jonas's friend from the schoolhouse whom she had met twice at community gatherings, a quiet child with his mother's dark hair and a gap between his front teeth that made him look younger than he was. She reached him by digging with her hands through the layers of frozen cloth and packed snow that had accumulated over him through 19 hours of storm, her fingers working without sensation, but still working, following instructions from her wrists and arms when the fingertips stopped reporting. She found his arm. She gripped it through the sleeve and pulled carefully because the cold had an effect on joints and bones that she did not fully understand but understood well enough to be afraid of. He came free of the pile slowly, and the first thing she registered was the weight, 40 pounds, perhaps dressed, and the weight felt wrong, too little, too compact, the weight of something that had given most of itself to staying alive through the night. His eyes opened. They did not focus, but they opened, which meant something fundamental was still running on minimal fuel inside a body that had been maintained through the night by the shared warmth of children who had arranged themselves around him in the dark without being asked. She pulled him against her chest and wrapped her coat around both of them and turned back toward the entry mound at the best speed she could manage, with 40 pounds of dead weight against her body and minus 44 degrees working on everything exposed. The distance was the same distance she had covered coming out, but returning it was longer, the specific geometry of emergency, where the way toward help is always measured in a different unit than the way away from it. She was calculating without deciding to calculate time to the mound at this pace time before Henry's wet clothing completed the damage it had been doing since sometime in the previous evening time, before her own hands stopped being hands in any functional sense. She fell the first time at roughly the 200-yard mark, her right foot breaking through a crusted drift that looked solid and finding nothing beneath it for 8 inches before striking hard ground, the angle of the impact driving her knee down and her shoulder into the packed snow beside it. Henry rolled partially clear of her coat. She was upright before she had consciously decided to stand, gathering him back against her, redistributing his weight, resuming the pace. The snow under her boots alternated between the scoured bare ground and the loose powder of the lighter drifts, offering no consistent surface to predict or trust. The second fall was different, both legs giving out together at roughly 100 yards from the mound, the cold having passed the threshold where her muscles were receiving instructions and beginning to interpret them as suggestions. She went down on both knees and stayed down for a moment that felt longer than it was, her body presenting a case for remaining at this elevation, the cold having achieved the specific deceptiveness it develops past 40 below, where the pain of stopping begins to resemble the relief of stopping. Henry lay beside her in the snow. She looked at the entry mound, the timber frame visible above the drifted surface, the shadow of the opening below it, the 45 feet remaining between where she was and where those 45 feet led. She crawled. This was not a decision so much as the body finding the next available option when the previous one had been removed from the list. She moved on her knees with Henry beside her. One hand gripping his sleeve, the knees finding purchase on the crust and breaking through it alternately, the entry mound approaching in the specific way that only very slow movement toward a fixed point approaches incrementally, visibly, maddeningly real. At 20 feet, she found her legs again, something restored by the lower position, or the brief rest, or simply by the proximity of destination, and she covered the last section upright. Help! The word came out louder than she expected, or perhaps it only seemed loud against the silence the storm had left behind. Help me! Thomas appeared at the opening before the second word fully formed. He had been awake, she would learn later, watching the entry cover from below. Since the sound stopped, knowing she would go out and understanding what going out meant. He climbed the ladder with the urgency of someone who had spent 19 hours motionless and needed no further persuasion about the nature of what was outside. He took Henry with both arms, lifting the child with the competence of someone whose body is working well and whose mind is fully committed to using that advantage, and descended. Astrid followed her grip on the rungs inadequate enough that the last 4 feet were more a controlled descent than a climb, and the floor of the chamber rose to meet her with the specific welcome of a place that has held the temperature it was built to hold. 52 degrees. She read it from the floor, lying on her back, letting the warmth of the earth work upward through her coat. The fire had burned to deep coals during the 2 hours she had been asleep before the storm broke, but the chamber had retained 48 degrees through that gap, and Thomas had rebuilt the blaze when the sound outside began to diminish, and it had climbed 4 degrees in the time it took her to reach Miss Dawson's position and return. Henry's core temperature, estimated by the heat she could feel or not feel, against her palm pressed to his sternum, through the shirt they had cut away too low, the specific absence of warmth from a body that has been spending its reserve for hours. Hypothermia. Not the superficial kind that resolves with warm blankets and a fire, but the deeper kind that requires the careful management of rewarming, because the body in the process of surviving has made internal arrangements that need to be undone in a specific sequence. She had read about this in a farming almanac 3 winters ago, a single paragraph about livestock recovery that had not seemed particularly relevant at the time and now seemed like the most important paragraph she had ever encountered. Warm water first. Not hot, the almanac had been clear on that, the word underlined by a previous reader who had apparently also needed the emphasis. Warm enough to carry heat, cool enough to avoid the shock of contrast against a core that has reorganized around its reduced temperature. She directed Jonas, who was steady in the way he became steady when the crisis was external and specific, and Sarah, who was already moving before the instruction arrived. Thomas held Henry against his chest, while the water warmed, transferring the body heat of a recovered adult to a child whose own supply was running critically low, which was not a medical technique Astrid had read about anywhere, but which seemed like the most available application of the most available resource. The shivering returned before the color did, which was correct. Shivering is the body's attempt to generate heat through movement, and its return meant something had been restored to the internal system that could make the attempt. The color followed in increments, pink, arriving at the cheeks before the fingertips, the normal sequence reversed from how it was lost. After 40 minutes, Henry's eyes achieved focus, the specific quality of eyes that had been somewhere else, and come back looking at the ceiling of the chamber and then at the people around him, with the gradual recognition of someone reassembling context from available fragments. "Where is Miss Dawson?" His voice was thin, the words produced carefully as though speech itself required calibration. "She went out to find Marcus and Clara. They went to check the horses before the storm. She said she would be right back." Astrid looked at Sarah across the fire. Sarah looked back with the old eyes she had been born with or acquired at 9 years old when the world clarified itself for her in the way it clarifies for children who survive what children should not have to survive. The information passed between them without language. "Miss Dawson is resting," Astrid told him. "You are safe. That's what matters right now, rest." He accepted this the way exhausted children accept things that a rested version of themselves might question, and closed his eyes, and the breathing that followed was slower and deeper than what had preceded it, which was the sound of something fundamental choosing to continue. She understood now what Miss Dawson had done. Not a random decision, not a failure of judgment, a teacher who had sent 2 older students outside to check the horses in the final minutes before the storm arrived, and had watched the horizon change and understood before anyone else in the schoolhouse what was about to happen, and had instructed the remaining children to lock the door and keep the fire burning and not open the door for any reason, and had gone out herself because the 2 students who had not returned were her students, and she was the adult who was responsible for them. She had gone out because that was what she was. The storm had taken her within minutes of her leaving the building, the whiteout eliminating the schoolhouse from view before she could reorient the temperature drop of 55 degrees in 7 hours, doing in minutes what it needed to do to a person without shelter in its path. It was not a story about poor judgment. It was a story about what it costs to be the person who goes when going might mean not returning. Astrid carried that understanding for the rest of her life in the specific way you carry things that cannot be put down, not always at the front of the mind, but always present, the way a stone carried long enough stops feeling like a stone and starts feeling like part of the hand. The settlement emerged from the storm and began its accounting. 18 children who had been locked in the schoolhouse survived. The older students had fed the fire through the night with every desk and chair and length of spare lumber they could find, and when the rescuers arrived from Ordway on the afternoon of the 13th, the building was still standing and everyone inside it was alive. Miss Dawson and the 4 children who had been outside were found when the snow was clear enough to allow searching. 2 settlers caught on the road between Ordway, and their claims were found in their wagon. The horses dead in the traces, the men beside them in the same arrested position of cold that had taken them before they could cover another mile. Across Dakota Territory and into Nebraska and Minnesota, the newspapers assembled a number 235 dead, 213 of them children. The warm morning had been the mechanism it had pulled families into, sending children to school without heavy coats, pulled teachers into opening windows, pulled farmers into delaying the errands they had been putting off since November, and then the temperature had fallen 55 degrees in 7 hours and found everyone it could find in the open. The Ordway station recorded minus 58 degrees as the low. The newspaper, searching for language adequate to what had happened, settled on the name that would remain attached to January 12, 1888, in the history of 3 territories, the school children's blizzard. In a pit 8 feet below the surface of a 160-acre claim in Elm Creek, the thermometer had not dropped below 47 degrees. The figure was not published in any newspaper. It existed only in a small notebook with a pencil stub worn to less than 2 inches, held by a girl of 17 who had spent 35 days digging the chamber that produced it. Elias Nordstrom came on the 5th day after the storm, riding alone on a horse still edgy from the trauma of the preceding week. the animal's ears moving with a vigilance that told her everything about what the storm had been like for the animals left outside. He dismounted at the edge of the entry mound with the careful movements of a man whose joints have absorbed a lifetime of Dakota and are now presenting him with a cumulative bill. He stood looking at the entry hole for a moment, and then at the thin thread of vapor rising from the ventilation shaft, and then he asked without preamble whether he could go down. They descended the ladder together, the man who had survived 11 winters and buried a wife and a son to cold, and the girl he had told in August would crawl back begging. He walked the full perimeter of the chamber without speaking, pressing his remaining fingers against the wall at 3 points, examining the ventilation shaft and the shale deflector with the attention of someone who understands mechanisms and is reverse engineering this one from its results. He studied the stone-lined fire pit and the sleeping benches carved into the clay. He looked at the paired temperature columns in the notebook she handed him without being asked, running his finger down the figures for January 12th, the exterior readings she had taken hourly through the night, and the interior temperature that had held 48 degrees without a fire for 4 hours and climbed to 51 with one. When he finished, he stood in the center of the chamber and faced her. His voice had the quality of something that required effort to produce, not because he lacked the words, but because he had spent a long time believing certain things, and the process of revising them in public was a different kind of labor than the physical kind. "I told you those children would freeze," he said. "I said you'd crawl back, begging if the Larson children hadn't starved first." He looked at the thermometer on the wall. "My barn dropped to 42 below during the storm. 3 of my cattle froze, standing their own breath, sealed their nostrils, and they suffocated where they stood. My house, with the stove burning all night, never got above 12 degrees inside." He paused, and the pause had the weight of something heavier than weather in it. "My oldest boy rode out to check the cattle when the storm arrived. He knew the terrain better than anyone. He knew every fence line, every post, every inch between the barn and the cattle shelter. His hand, the one with the missing fingers, moved against the seam of his coat. They found him the next morning, 30 yards from the barn door. "I'm sorry," Astrid said. "Don't be sorry." He stepped closer, and his voice dropped to the register a man uses when he is talking to himself as much as to another person. "Listen." He reached out and placed his 3 remaining fingers against the earthen wall, against the clay that had stayed warm, while cattle froze in barns and a young man died within sight of the shelter that should have saved him. "I have buried a wife to this cold, and a son to this cold, and now a second son. I have watched this territory take people who were strong, who were prepared, who had more experience and more resources than any single person on these claims. And I told you, because I believed it, that there was no way to survive a Dakota winter except with 30 cords of wood or $20 of coal. I was wrong. The earth kept you warm when our buildings failed, and our experience failed, and everything we thought we knew about staying alive in this place failed." He met her eyes. "I would like you to show me how you built this." She showed him. Not everything in the full process would take hours, and the full understanding would take a season, but the principles, the depth that mattered, the ventilation geometry, the entry collar, the drainage trench. He listened with the focused attention of a man who has decided to learn something and has no patience for anything in the lesson that is not the lesson. He asked 3 questions, each of them precise, each revealing that he had already understood the preceding point and was building toward the next one. When he climbed the ladder to leave, he paused at the top rung and looked back down at her in the chamber below and said the last thing she expected from him: "Your father would have been proud to see this." Ruth Hensley came the following day. She arrived with her son of 12 and her daughter of 10, and she stood at the entry hole longer than Nordstrom had before descending, looking at it with an expression that was working through something privately before she committed to the physical act of going down. At the bottom, she walked the same circuit, touched the same walls, but the way she touched them was different, where Nordstrom had pressed with the deliberate force of someone testing structural integrity. Ruth's touch was more like the touch of a person who is trying to understand how they misread something important. "I told you they flood," she said finally. "I told you snakes nest in the walls, and the roofs collapse, and going deeper just gives you a deeper grave." She was quiet for a moment. "I was describing the dugouts I had known. 4 feet built into hillsides subject to every problem I described. I didn't understand that the depth changes everything, that there's a point where the problems stop and the warmth begins." 8 feet, Astrid said. 7 might work in soil with better drainage. 8 is certain below where the cold can reach in any winter I've measured. Ruth looked at the notebook on its nail. She looked at the shale deflector and the ventilation opening and the fire pit whose stone lining she recognized as creek stone, because she knew the creek and she knew the distance from the creek to this claim, and she understood what it meant that someone had carried those stones in an apron, trip by trip, while also digging 8 feet of clay and building a roof from borrowed timber. "I'm going to build one," she said. "Before next winter. As soon as the ground thaws, I'll start digging. I'll help you mark the dimensions." Ruth looked at her sharply with the expression she used when she was processing a generosity that didn't fit the context she expected. "Why, after what I said to you after I called your idea a deeper grave?" "Because you gave me the tools when you thought I was wrong," Astrid said. "And because more families should have these. If every claim in this settlement had a pitch shelter, no one would have died in that storm. Not one person." Ruth Hensley was not a woman who expressed things through touch or affection when she felt it expressed itself through flower loans and tool lending and the specific quality of advice she gave only to people she believed were worth her honesty. She reached out and placed her hand briefly on Astrid's shoulder, the gesture clumsy with lack of practice, and said, "The ants were right, and so were you." Miriam Calder never came to see the pit. This was not surprising and not in the end important. The letter from the Territorial Orphan Board arrived at her home in Ordway in the first week of February, addressed in the formal script of a government office and polite in the way that official communications are polite when they are delivering a conclusion that one party will find unsatisfying, but that the other parties have made too clearly documented to contest. The board acknowledged the original inquiry. It noted the circumstances. It had since been made aware of the survival of 3 children in Astrid Bergman's care through the worst blizzard in recorded territorial history, the testimony provided voluntarily by Thomas Calder, describing the shelter's performance in detail, the statements submitted by Elias Nordstrom, and 5 other Elm Creek settlers. It concluded that no investigation into the Guardian's fitness was warranted. The matter was closed. Thomas described his mother's response without being asked because he seemed to feel it was information Astrid should have. Miriam had opened the letter at the kitchen table, read it with the stillness of a person who has been expecting a result and has been denied it, folded it once along its original crease, and placed it in the stove. She had not said Astrid's name since. When Astrid visited the Calder General Store in late February to purchase flour and seed corn for the spring planting, she was already planning. Henrik Calder looked up from the counter with the expression of a man who has had several weeks to adjust to a new understanding of how things stand. He set down the ledger he was working in. "Credit," he offered. "I have cash." "I know, but credit's available to you if you need it. Thomas told me what you did for him." He said it simply, without performance, the way a practical man acknowledges a debt he means to honor in the only currency he has available. Behind him in the back of the store, Miriam was arranging bolts of fabric on the shelving with a focus that was slightly too complete to be entirely natural. She did not speak, she did not turn, but she did not object, and in a store where she had previously made Astrid Bergman's account a closed door, the absence of objection was itself a kind of language. The campaign was over, not because Miriam had been persuaded of anything, but because the community had moved beyond the reach of any single person's influence to redirect, and she was a practical woman who understood when a position had become untenable. The spring thaw came in March and April, unfolding across the Dakota prairie with the particular patience of a season that has no reason to hurry because it knows it always wins. The ground softened from the surface down, reversing the process Astrid had tracked all winter in her notebook, the frost line retreating upward through the soil at a rate that mirrored its autumn descent. She pressed her palm against the pit walls each morning and tracked the boundary moving up 5 feet, 4-3, until the clay at every height was soft again, and the earth had returned to the same state it had been in when she drove the first shovel into it in early September. She did not wait for the ground to fully thaw before she began teaching. Ruth Hensley was first. They walked the Hensley claim together in late March, Astrid carrying the knotted rope she used to measure circles and the small diagram she had drawn on a folded piece of paper, Ruth carrying the pickaxe that had started everything. Astrid marked the circle and explained the drainage angle and described the frost line behavior she had measured through the winter, and Ruth listened with the methodical attention of someone who will not ask a question until she is certain she needs the answer, and who will remember every answer she receives. By April, Astrid was walking to different claims twice a week. The word had spread through the settlement the way it spreads when something proves itself in a way that cannot be argued against, not through gossip or persuasion, but through the simple fact of 5 people being alive when 235 were not, and the chamber that had kept them alive being measurable and reproducible, and here available for anyone who wanted to put their hands on the walls and feel what the earth held. She drew diagrams on scraps of brown paper and explained the ventilation principle to farmers who had never thought about convection and probably never would again, but understood the specific outcome she was describing: fire that did not need tending every 2 hours, chamber air that moved without drafts. She showed them how to cut the sod blocks for the roof and how to orient the roots and how to judge the drainage slope by laying a straight-edge board on the ground and watching where the water ran when she poured a cup at one end. She never charged for any of it. When a farmer named Ekstrom asked why he was 50 years old, had homesteaded his claim 9 years, and had the blunt directness of a man who does not understand why a resource would be given away when it could be exchanged for something, she told him, the warmth of the earth belongs to no one, and therefore it can be shared by everyone. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone deciding whether a thing is philosophy or business, and then he picked up his shovel and began marking his circle. By the autumn of 1888, 11 families in the Elm Creek settlement had pitch shelters under construction or complete. The designs varied. Some farmers built rectangular chambers instead of circular, finding the geometry more compatible with the timber they had available. Some in areas where the local frost line was shallower went to 7 feet rather than 8 and found it sufficient. One family with particularly wet ground built 2 parallel drainage trenches instead of 1 and reported the driest floor in the settlement. What all of them shared was the core principle Astrid had extracted from the Cliff Dweller book and tested in the coldest recorded night in Dakota's history: go below where the cold can reach, and the earth itself becomes the structure. The design traveled beyond Elm Creek in the way that practical solutions travel when they have been demonstrated rather than merely proposed. Families along the James River heard the story through the networks of communication that connected homesteaders across the prairie. The traders who moved between settlements, the riders who carried mail, the conversations that happened at the Ordway store between people whose claims were miles apart but whose winter problems were identical. Some received only the basic account: a girl in Elm Creek dug a pit 8 feet deep, and 5 people survived the school children's blizzard inside it, while 235 others did not. That was enough for some of them. They arrived at Astrid's claim and asked questions, or they arrived at their own versions of the same questions through their own winners of accumulated evidence, and the shelters went into the ground along the river valley and into the soil of claims near Ordway, and into the hills north of the territory that would soon have a new name. Astrid Bergman proved her claim in the spring of 1889. She had occupied the 160 acres and worked them continuously for the 6-year period required under the law, and her father had begun the clock, and she had continued it without interruption through typhoid and isolation, in the coldest winter in recorded territorial history, and the territory acknowledged this by issuing her the land patent in July, a document that transferred permanent title from the government to the woman who had earned it. Dakota Territory ceased to exist in November of that same year, divided at the 46th parallel into the states of North and South Dakota, and the patent converted accordingly, and the 160 acres became South Dakota soil, with a legal owner who knew every fence line and every marker post and the location of the ant mound on the western edge and the drainage angle of the ground between the shelter and the creek. The three Larson children asked to take her name the winter after the storm, after the orphan board's letter had confirmed that no one would be separating them from the woman who had dug them a home in the earth and kept them alive through the worst night the territory had produced. She said yes without deliberation. They became Sarah Bergman, Jonas Bergman, and Nora Bergman on a document filed with the county recorder at Ordway on a March afternoon when the snow was still thick on the ground, but the air had the particular quality it develops in late winter. The cold still real, but something underneath it beginning to change the way a room changes when a person enters even before you turn to see them. Sarah grew into the seriousness she had always carried, the quality that had looked in childhood like premature gravity and revealed itself in adulthood as simply who she was, a person of precise judgment and deep patience, qualities that proved useful in front of a classroom. She had watched Miss Ellen Dawson teach for 2 years and carried that model alongside her own intelligence, and when the replacement teacher retired from the Elm Creek School in 1902, Sarah Bergman took the position and held it for 23 years, teaching the children of families who had built pitch shelters from Astrid's diagrams alongside the children of families who had been skeptical until the storms settled the question. Jonas stayed on the claim beside Astrid through his 20s, working the soil with the focus intensity he had brought to everything since childhood. The fists finally unclenched, but the energy that had lived in them redirected into the land. He left for Montana in 1904, drawn west by land that was opening for homesteading, and he carried everything he knew about reading weather and working soil, and he built a pitch shelter before he built a cabin on his Montana claim, which was the most complete testimony he ever offered to what the winter of 1888 had taught him. Nora was married at 23 to a railroad man who moved freight through the Northern Territories and spoke with the confidence of someone who had been many places, which impressed her precisely because she had spent her formative years in the earth listening to blizzards and knew that confidence without experience is just noise. She settled in Fargo, raised children there, and lived to 83 in a house with a proper furnace and steam radiators. And every January when the thermometer dropped hard, she thought about a sleeping bench carved into Dakota clay and the specific warmth of something that asked nothing in return. Astrid married in 1893. Peter Strand was a widower of 41 whose first wife had died in the winter of 1891, not in a blizzard, but in the accumulated exhaustion of a winter that was too cold and too long for a woman already weakened by illness, which was a different kind of cold story, but a cold story nonetheless. He had heard about the Bergman shelter before he met the woman who built it, and when he finally met her at a settlement gathering in October, the thing he noted first was that she carried herself the way people carry themselves when they have done something no one else believed they could do and have stopped needing anyone to acknowledge it. He was a straightforward man who valued useful things above ornamental ones, and he considered this quality among the most useful he had encountered. He asked if she would consider him. She considered him for 6 weeks and said yes. They added a frame house to the property in 1900, proper walls, a proper stove, a proper bedroom for each person under the roof, the kind of structure her father had planned to build someday and never quite got to. It sat 50 feet east of the entry mound which remained. The pit shelter was used for storage in the years when the winters were moderate, and for the calves that would have died in the barn when the winters were not, and occasionally for the specific situation that no one discussed in advance, but that everyone who lived through 1888 understood without discussion, the nights when the wind came from the northwest, with a quality that made the oldest homesteaders bring the animals in close and check the wood supply, and make sure the entry cover was clear of drift. She died in the spring of 1927, 57 years old, which was younger than most of the people who had doubted her in August of 1887 would have predicted for someone who had decided in the autumn of her 17th year to bet her life and the lives of 3 children on the warmth of the earth below the frost line. The cause was pneumonia, a winter illness, which had a particular irony that Sarah noted privately and said nothing about publicly. She was buried in the Elm Creek Cemetery on a hillside that faced east, beside her father and her mother, in ground she had known for 26 years. Sarah chose the headstone inscription because she was the one who would have known what it should say, and because she was the kind of person who insists on getting the right thing in a stone rather than settling for the available thing. The stonecutter in Ordway asked her to repeat it twice, not because he hadn't heard, but because he wanted to be certain, and she repeated it with the patience of a woman who has spent 23 years teaching children to understand things precisely. It was 7 words. It was exactly right. She listened to the earth. The claim passed to Sarah, who had worked it alongside Astrid and Peter through the decade before his death in 1921, and Sarah worked it until her own retirement, and the frame house stood another 40 years before the county acquired the property for different purposes, and the pit shelter was filled in at some point in that transition, the entry mound leveled and seeded over until there was nothing at the surface to distinguish it from the surrounding soil. The drainage trench was still faintly visible in 1953. An old farmer told the county recorder, if you walked the right line on the property in late afternoon when the shadows were long, and you knew what you were looking for. After that, nothing. The land returned to itself. But before any of that, before the frame house and the land patent and the names on the headstone there, was the spring of 1889, and before anything else in that spring, there was a morning in April when the snow had finally gone from the western fence line, and the ground had thawed to at least an inch of depth, and the air had crossed the threshold where it reliably stayed above freezing for more than a few hours at a stretch. Astrid was walking the fence line, the same fence line she had walked every autumn since they arrived in Dakota, checking the posts, noting which wire had gone slack over winter, measuring the work the season would require when she reached the ant mound. It was different from the previous autumn's version. The storm had flattened the upper portion, and the winter's freeze-thaw cycles had compressed the soil around its base, and the structure overall was lower than it had been at its August peak, the extraordinary height of that summer reduced by the weather it had predicted. But the colony was intact. She knew this before she saw any movement, because the entrances were open, the sealed closures of autumn removed from within the tunnels, accessible again. The architectural investment of years of colony activity having survived whatever the winter had placed on top of it, because the colony itself had survived it, at whatever depth was equivalent in their ancient compact with the earth, waiting with the patience of something that does not doubt the outcome of winter. The workers emerged in the particular fashion of emergence, not all at once, but in a building progression, 1 and then 3, and then a dozen, and then too many to track individually, each carrying something outward from the colony's depths, pebbles and soil fragments, and the debris of 7 months of underground life, clearing the passages, re-establishing the clear disk around the mound's perimeter, beginning again the patient work of building. They moved with the purposeful quality she had spent 3 years learning to read, and the purpose now was different from the urgent preparation of the previous August. This was the ordinary industry of a colony returning to its surface work, the urgency replaced by something more settled. The knowledge of what had been survived replaced by the focus on what came next. She knelt beside the mound in the April grass. The ground was wet under her knees, and the cold that lived in the soil through the winter was still faintly present at the surface, retreating ahead of the warmth that was coming from above, while the warmth from below came up to meet it. The workers moved around her hands without disruption, incorporating her presence into the landscape, the way wild things incorporate the presence of something that has learned to hold still. They had known what was coming in July, 8 months before it arrived. They had carried darker soil from deeper depths, and built their mound to a height that told anyone paying attention that the coming winter would require preparation at as how ordinary seasons did not. They had stayed underground through the fall spring of January 11th, when everything above them declared that winter had released its claim, and they had been right about that too. Right when the air temperature and the light and the smell of the morning all agreed on a verdict the ants refused to ratify. They had come out now in April because April was the answer to the question January had asked, and they had always known the difference. Astrid stayed beside the mound until the light moved and the shadow of the fence line crossed the ground beside her. The workers paid her no attention. They had work to do, and they were doing it, carrying pebbles grain by grain, building higher, preparing as they always prepared, as they had always prepared, as they would always prepare for whatever the next winter might bring. She had listened. The earth had answered. And the answer was still here, still being worked out in the patient industry of creatures who had never needed anyone to tell them what depth meant, who had always known where the warmth lived and how far down you had to go to find it, and who would go on knowing long after the last person who had learned to read them was in the ground.